As time went on, during the late 1980s, the Dietitians Board was looking at introducing competencies for registration. And this was a new concept to me. I mean, I thought it was great, but I'd never had to think about it. And I sat in on their sessions when they used what was called the DACUM, D-A-C-U-M method of designing a curriculum, which was a very interactive process, different to quite a few other processes. And I liked the way it was brainstormed out and using an independent facilitator who knew nothing about dietetics. So I thought it would be a good thing for physiotherapists as well. And there were no such things as professional competencies around at that time. In fact, a lot of professional groups thought it was impossible to do. You just knew what you had to do. It was an art and a science, and you just knew what was good and what was right and what wasn't right. But I felt there was more to it than that, and that you'd still have the same concepts, but you actually have to document it. And then you see whether people measure up to that documentation. It's the same thing, it's just documenting it. So I started designing, got approval from the board to do competencies for registration. So we used the same method again, had an independent facilitator, and everything goes out to and fro to the society and back to the schools and the thing, a lot of toing and froing as you develop it and refine it. And we did the core competence, then you got people back again, then they did the backup competencies for the major competencies. And then that became in time the competencies for registration, which the schools then had to follow. And it was quite unique. We were the only ones, as far as I'm aware, and the literature I read at the time and from the people that was supporting us during that process, it was the first time any professions had developed competencies as far as they knew in the world. So it was quite innovative and quite progressive. And then, of course, we realised that if you're going to have competencies, you have to then have a process of measuring whether those competencies are being met. So we started to design an accreditation process, and that obviously was much later along the system. We ran into a few problems with the schools because they were going through a development time as well and being supported under the education system for, instead of the old apprenticeship type of training, they were being linked into the education system. So they were going through a big learning process, and they were getting and developing their power and strength, and they believed, we had the two heads of school on the physiotherapy board as set out under the legislation, they believed that the board should just trust the schools. The schools knew what they were doing, and the board should just rubber stamp and do well. The schools knew what was happening out there. Well, we knew from our visits to the health boards and the hospitals that in fact schools didn't know what was required out in the field, and they felt that they were not getting the best quality physiotherapists that they used to have, which of course is always when you're going through a change process, is always difficult to cope with. I didn't think it was as bad as that, but anyway, that was their view. And working with the development of legislation and occupational regulation issues at the time, you realise that the regulatory board is in fact very important. It's your entry to the profession, and it's a very important role that board undertakes. So we said, no, it's actually you've got to meet what the board said. You've got to meet the competencies, and we need to know whether you're meeting them. Well, we used to have some really very, very difficult board meetings as the schools tried to stick to their guns, and I stuck to my guns, which had to do most of the talking about that aspect, because the physios on the board didn't really know all this stuff, so they tended to follow the schools a little bit, thinking, well, they must know what they're talking about. They are the school, after all. So things got so difficult at times. We had to bring in the Ministry of Education officials who were in the tertiary education sector to tell the schools, and sometimes I removed myself from those meetings during that time because I'd left it to them, and they would tell them that what the school's role was, what the board's role was, and that the schools had to meet the standards that the board set, and that was, they just had to more or less, not quite like that, but get on with it. And it was the board's right to set the standard. That's their role, that's what the legislative role was. So we used to have some pretty hefty meetings. I'd have some sleepless nights before each meeting as we knew it was going to be a difficult time, and you knew where you were going, what the right direction was. But we got on well afterwards. I mean, with the heads of school, I got on well with the heads of school. I was on their selection committees for selection panels for quite a long time. But it was a difficult time. And at the time, we were thinking they were wanting to give up the state examination, physiotherapy, which I believe needed to be given up. However, at the time it was a monitoring system and could be used, if they really worked it out properly, could be used for overseas people coming in and see whether they met the standard. However, we did have one member on the board who really pushed to get rid of it. And unfortunately, I believe it went earlier than it should have. I believe it should have been phased. When we were happy with the schools, what the schools were doing, then you could phase it out. But until such time, so we used to have these battles. And it was during that time too, we had running the state exam, and I got outside people who were dealing with competencies. It was how the state exams got linked into competency. That was working very well. The questions were very carefully designed in the written papers to be able to be assessed properly, and they were taught how to decide what they wanted out of those questions. And they had to be very carefully phrased, and we went through a lot of things with the educationists and things, how you phrase those questions. And then the examiners were taught to do it, and we had one examiner who said, well, I just know whether they're right or whether it's not right when I'm doing the practical. And I said, well, that's fine, write down what it is that you know. All we're asking you to do is just to write down what you expect to see in a particular treatment or a particular thing, is just note it down. And then they've either met it or they haven't met it. And it took a while for some of the practical side to come round to that thinking, which is basically just competence with can they do it safely, can they not, and whatever. And it was linked again back to the competencies for registration and whether they were sort of covered. And I think it was working very well, and in fact, it was working so well that the IFOMT, the manipulative therapists, took it up, and they set competencies, and they started using the same process of examination, because one of the people on the manipulative therapist committee was part of our examination panel. Well, a couple of them had been at different times. And they thought the process was good and reliable and able to be validated and so on. So they then developed their processes through that, on that basis too. So we were, I suppose, leading the way in the physiotherapy practice for a lot of that time. And also around about that same time as we're doing the competencies, for my advisory role, we developed the roles and responsibilities for physiotherapists, and that came under the workforce development side of things, which we had quite a big section in the Department of Health at that time. We'd had a chap out from the United States who was very much into workforce development, and it was based on the fact that you need to be very clear what your role is. What is a physiotherapist's role vis-a-vis an OT role, vis-a-vis a nursing role, or somebody or other else, because there always were at that time too, and it's probably happened in other jurisdictions too, there's blurring of a lot of roles. OTs blame physios for doing certain things. Physios blame OTs for stepping into their territory, and respiratory therapy is another one, or inhalation therapy, whatever you want to call it. So he was encouraging different groups to define, so that you could say, this is what a physiotherapist looks like, this is what a physiotherapist does. So we did that with people coming in, and we developed the roles and responsibilities of physiotherapists, and that was a very good document, and it was used again in negotiations and all sorts of things. And then also at the same time we felt it was important to do electrotherapy standards as well. So that was another document that we produced with, again, the interaction from the profession and the society and things like that. So that was safety and practical electrotherapy techniques. So, I feel quite proud really of a lot of the things that I've done over the time, or with the help of, obviously, of physiotherapists out in practice in the physiotherapy field. But I think, looking back, I think we've actually done some pretty good stuff really.